The truth is, most people misunderstand this. We walk entirely blindly into the grand, imposing, and heavily polished marble lobbies of massive global financial institutions, carrying the incredibly heavy, blood-soaked fruits of our finite, fiercely unrenewable mortality, our hard-earned savings, and we willingly, desperately hand them over to complete strangers wearing tailored suits. We are heavily, persistently, and deeply conditioned by an incredibly powerful, trillion-dollar societal narrative that loudly dictates a terrifying, paralyzing lie. The global financial markets are far too incredibly complex, deeply chaotic, and mathematically advanced for the average, ordinary human mind to ever possibly comprehend. We are strictly taught that we absolutely must outsource our ultimate financial destiny to these highly compensated, seemingly omniscient professionals, trusting them to navigate the turbulent, terrifying oceans of global commerce on our behalf. We accept the toxic, widely celebrated dogma of extreme diversification, blindly throwing our precious life energy into massive, opaque mutual funds containing hundreds of completely unknown companies, silently praying to the unpredictable gods of the market that our fragile retirement accounts will somehow magically survive the inevitable, violent macroeconomic storms. But the profound, transformative, and deeply revolutionary narrative embedded within the core of this journey violently shatters this incredibly dangerous, widely accepted illusion, exposing the traditional, institutionalized financial advisory system as a highly efficient, meticulously engineered machine designed fundamentally to continuously siphon immense, staggering wealth away from the exhausted, working masses and funnel it directly into the deep, unquenchable pockets of Wall Street insiders, regardless of whether the actual market violently crashes or triumphantly soars. To completely deconstruct this massive, global deception and deeply understand the absolute, unshakable truth of wealth creation, the narrative introduces a profoundly grounded, deeply relatable archetype, a man we shall simply call the river guide. The river guide did not possess a prestigious, highly expensive Ivy League Master of Business Administration degree, nor did he spend his youth walking the hallowed, highly exclusive, and deeply intimidating halls of elite financial academies. He existed on the absolute, ragged, and sun-scorched fringes of the traditional American economy. He lived a life of extreme, punishing physical minimalism, residing in a fragile, temporary nylon tent pitched on the coarse, dusty dirt near the roaring, violent banks of the Colorado River. He survived on a meager, deeply impoverished diet of cheap beans and boiled rice, earning an incredibly minuscule, almost non-existent wage by physically guiding heavy, inflatable rafts filled with terrified tourists through the massive, bone-crushing, and highly lethal whitewater rapids of the Grand Canyon. He was an absolute, undisputed master of physical survival, intimately understanding the chaotic, violent, and entirely unpredictable fluid dynamics of the deadly river, possessing the immense, terrifying physical courage required to look sudden, violent death directly in the eye and skillfully steer a fragile vessel safely through the roaring, deafening foam. Yet, despite his incredible, undeniable physical mastery and deep, primal courage, he was completely, utterly, and terrifyingly ignorant of the invisible, sweeping currents of the global economic river. He possessed absolutely zero financial assets. He harbored a deep, entirely paralyzing fear of his own rapidly approaching, impoverished future, and he had completely resigned himself to the deeply depressing, heavily conditioned belief that true, generational wealth was an exclusive, heavily guarded country club that completely, permanently barred the door to individuals of his low, uneducated, and entirely blue-collar pedigree. The profound, earth-shattering catalyst that would violently alter the entire trajectory of the river guide's mortal existence did not occur in a sterile, heavily air-conditioned corporate boardroom, but amidst the terrifying, deafening, and entirely chaotic roar of a massive, deadly river rapid, during a particularly violent, unpredictable, and highly treacherous commercial expedition. The incredibly heavy, heavily loaded raft carrying his clients struck a massive, submerged, and completely invisible boulder hidden deep beneath the churning, white water foam. The incredibly violent, sudden impact instantly, catastrophically flipped the massive vessel, aggressively violently throwing the terrified, screaming passengers directly into the freezing, bone-crushing, and highly lethal current. In that absolute, terrifying fraction of a second, instinct and deeply ingrained training completely overrode human panic. The river guide plunged violently into the freezing, chaotic maelstrom, risking his own finite, precious life, fiercely battling the incredibly powerful, suffocating undertow to physically, desperately drag a drowning, heavily panicked older man out of the lethal, churning vortex and safely onto the harsh, rocky sanctuary of the riverbank. As the adrenaline slowly, agonizingly faded and the freezing, entirely exhausted survivors huddled desperately around a small, flickering campfire late into the dark, incredibly silent night, a profound, deeply life-altering revelation emerged from the shadows. The older man, shivering violently under a thin thermal blanket, deeply looked the river guide directly in his exhausted eyes. This man was absolutely not a mere, ordinary tourist. He was a highly reclusive, staggeringly wealthy, and incredibly brilliant titan of the financial investment world. A man who commanded hundreds of millions of dollars and sat on the highly exclusive, incredibly powerful boards of massive, global corporations. The wealthy titan, deeply, profoundly moved by the river guide's incredible, selfless physical courage, recognized a tragic, deeply agonizing irony. He looked at the impoverished, physically exhausted young man and delivered a piercing, unforgettable, and entirely paradigm-shifting observation. You are an absolute master at navigating the incredibly dangerous, lethal currents of this physical river, but you are entirely, completely drowning in the invisible, rapid currents of the financial river, attempting to desperately navigate without a single, functioning paddle, in an incredible, deeply emotional, and entirely unprecedented act of profound gratitude for the literal salvation of his own breathing life. The wealthy titan made a staggering, world-altering offer. He offered to completely, entirely strip away the heavy, deeply intimidating, and entirely fabricated veil of complexity that Wall Street deliberately uses to terrify the masses. He offered to teach the impoverished, financially illiterate river guide the absolute, most closely guarded, and deeply fundamental secrets of how the truly, obscenely wealthy actually deploy their capital, entirely bypassing the highly toxic, fee-draining mutual fund industry. The river guide, sitting in the cold, dusty dirt, entirely bankrupt and deeply terrified of his own future, enthusiastically, desperately accepted this profound mentorship, officially embarking on a grueling, incredibly transformative, and deeply psychological journey that would magically, beautifully mutate a meager, seemingly insignificant $1,000 grubstake into a staggering, multi-million-dollar, absolutely unshakable financial empire within a mere, highly condensed 5 years. Analyzing this incredible, primal, and deeply foundational phase of the narrative entirely exposes the incredibly toxic, highly manipulative, and deeply destructive psychological trap that successfully ensnares the vast, overwhelming majority of the global working class. The massive, towering mutual fund industry heavily relies on a deeply ingrained, entirely false societal narrative that aggressively preaches the absolute necessity of blindly handing over control. They charge massive, incredibly destructive, and completely invisible management fees, heavily skimming a significant, mathematical percentage of the total assets under management every single year, completely regardless of whether the actual market wildly succeeds or violently, completely crashes, over the agonizing, stretching course of a standard 40-year working career. These seemingly tiny, insignificant, and entirely hidden percentage fees violently, mathematically compound into a staggering, entirely catastrophic theft, literally devouring more than half of the individual investor's total, potential lifelong gains. The river guide deeply, painfully learned that the so-called professional experts actively, heavily rely on the average person remaining completely, terrifyingly ignorant and entirely paralyzed by the sheer, fabricated complexity of the financial terminology. The absolute, very first, and most profound psychological barrier that must be violently, aggressively shattered is the deeply held, heavily conditioned belief that you are simply not smart enough, not mathematically gifted enough, or not highly educated enough to successfully manage your own life energy. The wealthy mentor proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt. That truly masterful, entirely unassailable investing absolutely does not require advanced, complex calculus, high-frequency, highly stressful computer algorithms, or an incredibly expensive, highly elite degree. It strictly, exclusively requires basic, simple fourth-grade mathematics, incredible, unyielding emotional discipline, and the fierce, uncompromising application of a single, entirely unbreakable philosophical law. This single, incredibly profound, and entirely overarching philosophical law, heavily passed down from the absolute greatest, most legendary value investors in the history of global commerce, is shockingly, incredibly simple, yet almost universally, tragically ignored by the frantic, highly emotional, and completely undisciplined masses. It is the absolute, foundational bedrock upon which the entire, massive architecture of immense, generational wealth is meticulously, carefully built. The mentor looked deeply into the roaring, hypnotic flames of the campfire and delivered the absolute, undeniable, and entirely uncompromising core of his entire financial philosophy. Rule number 1. Absolutely, unequivocally, never lose money. Rule number 2. Absolutely, never, ever forget rule number 1. To the uninitiated, completely naive listener, this simple, incredibly brief statement sounds like a highly facetious, entirely redundant, and completely unhelpful cliché. Of course, absolutely no one actively, intentionally enters the incredibly volatile, highly dangerous financial markets with the specific, conscious desire to physically lose their hard-earned capital. But the narrative aggressively, highly analytically, and deeply mathematically deconstructs this seemingly simple statement, revealing the profound, terrifying, and completely unforgiving biological mathematics of catastrophic financial loss that the average, highly emotional investor completely, tragically fails to comprehend. When a standard, entirely average investor blindly purchases a highly volatile, completely unknown stock simply because an energetic, highly charismatic television pundit loudly recommended it, or because their completely uninformed, highly enthusiastic neighbor bragged about it at a casual weekend gathering, they are absolutely not engaging in the highly disciplined, profoundly analytical act of investing. They are aggressively, recklessly, and entirely foolishly gambling in a heavily rigged, deeply cynical global casino. When the inevitable, completely predictable, and highly violent macroeconomic market correction eventually, ruthlessly occurs, and their completely unresearched, highly speculative portfolio suddenly, violently plummets by a terrifying, devastating 50%, the average human brain completely, fundamentally miscalculates the horrific, staggering mathematical magnitude of the required recovery. The deeply flawed, highly optimistic human mind intuitively, entirely incorrectly assumes that a 50% loss simply requires a corresponding 50% gain to magically, perfectly return to the original, starting baseline. But the brutal, completely unforgiving, and deeply cold mathematics of the financial universe dictate a far more terrifying, highly exhausting reality. If an individual possesses $100,000 of finite, hard-earned life energy, and they completely, tragically lose 50% in a sudden, violent market crash, they are left holding a meager, heavily bleeding $50,000 to simply, barely return to the original, starting baseline of $100,000. That severely crippled, heavily diminished $50,000 must now achieve a staggering, incredibly difficult, and historically highly unlikely 100% mathematical return. The hole they have completely, recklessly dug for themselves is mathematically, exponentially deeper and significantly, incredibly harder to successfully climb out of than the initial, painful loss suggests. This incredibly terrifying, highly mathematical realization is the absolute, foundational reason why the deeply ingrained philosophy of rule number 1 is not merely a catchy, highly marketable slogan. It is an absolute, non-negotiable, and entirely biological imperative for ultimate financial survival. The truly wealthy, incredibly successful elite absolutely, fundamentally refuse to play the highly frantic, deeply emotional, and entirely unpredictable game of hopeful market speculation. They absolutely do not blindly throw their massive, incredibly valuable capital into the dark, churning void and silently pray for a highly unlikely, miraculous upward trajectory. They deeply, profoundly realize that the absolute fastest, most reliable, and highly exponential way to rapidly, incredibly grow their immense wealth is to aggressively, fiercely, and completely ruthlessly protect the fragile downside. They operate with the lethal, highly calculated, and incredibly patient precision of an elite, heavily camouflaged sniper, utterly completely willing to sit completely still in the high grass for agonizing months, or even stretching, highly boring years, holding their massive, unencumbered cash reserves completely safe, absolutely refusing to take a single, speculative shot until the specific, highly optimal target steps perfectly, entirely unaware into the bright, clear crosshairs. They completely, permanently redefine the entire, fundamental concept of what it actually means to purchase a stock, violently stripping away the flashing, chaotic, and highly distracting red and green numbers dancing frantically on a digital screen, and preparing the eager, highly awakened river guide to deeply, completely understand the intricate, highly fundamental, and entirely unshakable mechanical anatomy of a truly great, entirely unassailable business through the rigorous, unforgiving application of a highly specific, four-part evaluation system. The incredibly dangerous, highly chaotic, and entirely unpredictable flashing red and green numbers dancing frantically across the glowing screens of global financial television networks are deliberately, maliciously designed to induce a state of perpetual, exhausting anxiety and entirely blind, reactive panic. The wealthy, highly reclusive mentor completely, violently stripped this toxic, highly distracting digital noise away from the deeply observant, highly eager river guide's vision, fundamentally, permanently shifting his entire psychological paradigm. He was aggressively, ruthlessly taught to completely stop viewing a stock as a magical, highly volatile lottery ticket that magically fluctuates based entirely on the chaotic, completely unpredictable whims of a faceless, highly emotional mob. Instead, he was profoundly, deeply conditioned to view a stock exactly as it truly, fundamentally exists in the physical, breathing world, as a fractional, legal ownership stake in an actual, living, breathing, and highly operational business. The narrative deeply immerses the reader into the absolute, foundational core of this profound transformation, introducing the incredibly rigorous, entirely uncompromising, and highly analytical evaluation system known universally to the elite as the 4Ms. This is absolutely not a loose, highly flexible set of casual guidelines. It is a brutal, heavily fortified, and entirely unforgiving four-part gauntlet that any prospective company must completely, flawlessly survive before a single, highly protected dollar of the investor's finite, precious life energy is ever deployed. The incredibly arduous, deeply analytical journey begins with the absolute, non-negotiable first pillar, meaning, the vast, overwhelming majority of amateur, highly emotional investors completely, tragically fail at this very first, seemingly simple hurdle. They blindly, desperately chase highly complex, incredibly obscure pharmaceutical companies waiting on unpredictable, highly volatile government approvals, or they throw massive, hard-earned capital at entirely incomprehensible, deeply convoluted technological startups simply because the charismatic, highly polished CEO used a string of impressive, completely meaningless buzzwords on a popular financial podcast. The mentor looked the river guide directly in the eye and delivered a highly profound, incredibly liberating decree. If you do not completely, intuitively, and entirely understand exactly how a specific business fundamentally creates value and successfully extracts cash from the global marketplace, you must absolutely, aggressively, and permanently walk away without a single, lingering ounce of regret. This is the profound, deeply defensive concept of the circle of competence. The river guide did not need to possess a highly advanced, incredibly complex understanding of global semiconductor supply chains or obscure, highly mathematical derivatives. He only needed to deeply, fundamentally understand a few, highly specific industries that natively resonated with his own personal passions, his direct consumer experiences, and his inherent, highly grounded worldview. If a business falls completely outside of this fiercely protected, highly sacred circle, it is entirely, permanently dead to the investor. By ruthlessly, strictly enforcing the principle of meaning, the investor completely, beautifully eliminates the terrifying, highly paralyzing fear of the unknown, transforming the chaotic, entirely unpredictable global market into a small, highly curated, and completely comprehensible neighborhood of familiar, easily understood businesses. Once a business successfully, flawlessly passes the incredibly strict, highly personal filter of meaning, it must immediately, violently face the second, significantly more terrifying, and profoundly structural gauntlet, the moat. In the brutal, highly predatory, and completely unforgiving battleground of global capitalism, any company that miraculously discovers a highly lucrative, incredibly profitable method of generating massive cash will instantly, inevitably, and aggressively attract a massive, heavily armed swarm of ruthless, highly capitalized competitors desperate to violently steal that profit margin. The narrative brilliantly utilizes the evocative, deeply historical imagery of a towering, heavily fortified medieval castle completely surrounded by a massive, deep, and heavily armed trench of rushing water. A business without an incredibly wide, deep, and highly unbreachable economic moat is simply a fragile, highly vulnerable sandcastle sitting helplessly on the shore, completely destined to be violently, inevitably washed away by the relentless, crushing tide of aggressive market competition. The mentor meticulously, carefully outlined the 5 distinct, highly powerful, and entirely unassailable types of economic moats that the river guide must ruthlessly hunt for. First, the incredible, deeply psychological power of the brand moat, where a company like a massive, global beverage manufacturer or a dominant, highly innovative technology giant has so deeply, permanently embedded its specific identity into the global consumer consciousness that people will irrationally, happily pay a massive, highly inflated premium simply to possess that specific logo. Second, the highly secretive, deeply guarded secret moat, constructed entirely of heavily protected, legally binding patents, highly complex, proprietary chemical formulas, or deeply entrenched, entirely unreplicable intellectual property that legally, completely prevents any competitor from ever legally duplicating the product. Third, the highly lucrative, entirely monopolistic toll moat, where a specific company completely, entirely controls the single, highly essential bridge, pipeline, or communication network that everyone else in the entire industry must absolutely, desperately use to conduct their daily business, allowing the tollkeeper to effortlessly, continuously extract massive, highly predictable fees. Fourth, the deeply structural, highly sticky switching moat, where a company provides a service or software ecosystem so deeply, comprehensively integrated into the daily, highly complex operations of their massive clients that the agonizing, incredibly expensive, and highly disruptive process of leaving for a competitor is fundamentally, mathematically worse than simply enduring periodic, continuous price increases. And finally, the massive, highly intimidating price moat, achieved when a colossal, highly optimized global retail giant leverages its massive, entirely unprecedented scale to ruthlessly, permanently drive production and distribution costs down to such a microscopic, incredibly low level that absolutely no emerging competitor could ever possibly survive a prolonged, bloody price war. If a company does not clearly, undeniably possess at least one, and preferably multiple, incredibly deep, highly fortified moats, it is absolutely, permanently rejected, entirely regardless of its current, highly intoxicating profit margins or explosive, heavily hyped growth projections. If a company possesses a deep, highly resonant meaning and a massive, entirely unbreachable economic moat, it has successfully proven its immense, undeniable structural superiority. But the incredibly rigorous, highly demanding evaluation is still completely, entirely unfinished. The third, highly critical, and deeply human pillar must now be fiercely, aggressively interrogated. Management. The most magnificent, incredibly fortified, and highly profitable economic castle in the entire world can still be easily, completely, and tragically destroyed from the inside out if the individual sitting on the throne is a deeply corrupt, highly incompetent, or entirely selfish leader. The river guide was heavily, intensely trained to look far past the highly polished, meticulously scripted, and entirely fabricated public relations statements delivered seamlessly by charismatic, highly compensated chief executive officers during quarterly earnings calls. He was aggressively taught to act as a highly skeptical, deeply forensic private investigator, ruthlessly, meticulously digging into the actual, historical, and highly verifiable track record of the specific human beings holding the ultimate, absolute power over the company's massive capital. Do these highly powerful executives act entirely, selflessly as deeply dedicated, highly protective stewards of the shareholders' precious, heavily invested capital, or do they act exactly like greedy, highly predatory pirates, constantly, relentlessly enriching themselves with massive, entirely unearned bonuses, heavily diluted stock options, and exorbitant, highly offensive compensation packages while the actual, underlying business slowly, agonizingly stagnates? The investor must absolutely, entirely demand that the management team possesses profound, unshakable, and entirely verifiable integrity, an incredibly clear, highly rational, and deeply focused long-term vision, and a massive, highly aligned personal financial stake in the exact same equity they are managing. If the river guide detected even a single, faint, and highly subtle whisper of corporate deception, accounting manipulation, or deeply entrenched, highly arrogant executive greed, he was strictly, fiercely ordered to immediately, permanently abandon the investment, entirely regardless of how incredibly wide the economic moat or how deeply resonant the meaning might initially appear. A great, truly unassailable business fundamentally, absolutely requires great, entirely honorable human beings to successfully, continuously guide it through the highly unpredictable, incredibly dangerous, and deeply chaotic storms of the global macroeconomic environment. Analyzing this incredibly rigorous, deeply systemic, and highly profound evaluation process entirely exposes the absolute, fundamental difference between a terrified, highly reactive market speculator and a completely sovereign, highly empowered, and entirely rational business owner. The amateur, highly emotional investor is constantly, relentlessly reacting to entirely meaningless, highly chaotic external stimuli, the sudden, terrifying downgrade by a highly conflicted Wall Street analyst, the highly dramatic, entirely fabricated panic manufactured by a loud, screaming television pundit, or the sudden, entirely unpredictable geopolitical headline that temporarily, violently shocks the highly sensitive global market. They are entirely, completely blown around by the chaotic, invisible winds of market sentiment like a fragile, dying leaf. But the practitioner of the 4Ms, deeply entrenched in this incredibly powerful, entirely unshakable methodology, is entirely, completely immune to this highly toxic, deeply exhausting, and entirely paralyzing external noise, by rigorously, relentlessly, and highly systematically verifying the profound meaning, the massive, deeply fortified economic moat, and the highly honorable, deeply competent management. The investor successfully, beautifully, and entirely permanently shifts their entire psychological focus away from the chaotic, unpredictable, and highly volatile daily stock price and places it entirely, securely, and profoundly onto the highly predictable, incredibly stable, and deeply verifiable long-term economic value of the actual, underlying business enterprise. They have successfully, entirely transformed their deeply vulnerable, highly frightened mindset from a desperate, hoping gambler at a heavily rigged roulette table into a highly analytical, deeply patient, and incredibly powerful corporate acquirer. The river guide, entirely, deeply transformed by this incredibly powerful, highly systemic education, had successfully, meticulously identified a highly exclusive, incredibly small, and deeply coveted watchlist of truly magnificent, entirely unassailable, and highly fortified global businesses that flawlessly, perfectly passed the first three incredibly demanding pillars of the rigorous evaluation process. He intimately, deeply understood their highly efficient, massive cash-generating models. He incredibly clearly saw their massive, entirely unbreachable competitive advantages aggressively destroying weaker rivals. And he deeply, entirely trusted the highly honorable, incredibly competent human beings sitting in the heavily guarded executive suites, but the incredibly wise, highly experienced, and entirely patient mentor completely, violently restrained the highly eager, deeply excited river guide from immediately, aggressively pulling the trigger and blindly deploying his highly finite, precious, and incredibly hard-earned capital. The mentor deeply, profoundly understood that absolutely everything they had meticulously, carefully analyzed up to this exact, specific point only successfully, undeniably answered the highly critical question of precisely what magnificent, entirely unassailable business to ultimately buy. The final, absolute, and most terrifyingly important question, the ultimate, highly guarded secret that entirely, completely separates the deeply average, wildly struggling investor from the legendary, multi-billionaire titans of global finance. The final, incredibly powerful key that perfectly, flawlessly mathematically guarantees the absolute, unbreakable fulfillment of rule number 1, still entirely, heavily remained to be aggressively, masterfully executed. The river guide now had to deeply, profoundly learn the agonizing, incredibly difficult, and highly emotional art of absolute, unyielding patience, preparing his highly disciplined, entirely focused mind to execute the fourth, final, and absolute most incredibly powerful pillar of the entire, world-altering philosophy. He had to patiently, silently wait in the deep, highly camouflaged shadows for the perfect, flawless, and highly inevitable moment of massive, global panic, entirely preparing to ruthlessly, aggressively deploy the ultimate, completely invincible, and highly mathematical weapon of absolute financial sovereignty, setting the grand, magnificent stage for the incredibly dramatic, highly lucrative, and entirely life-changing execution of the margin of safety, completely redefining his entire financial reality and entirely obliterating the deeply toxic, highly destructive fear of market crashes, successfully transforming terrifying, catastrophic economic volatility into a massive, highly predictable, and incredibly exponential engine of profound, absolute, and entirely sovereign generational wealth. The incredibly eager, highly transformed, and deeply awakened river guide now possessed the ultimate, highly curated, and entirely exclusive watch list of magnificent, entirely unassailable global businesses, but the immensely wealthy, deeply seasoned mentor completely, violently halted his forward advance, introducing the absolute most excruciating, highly counterintuitive, and deeply psychological phase of the entire methodology. The global financial market was currently roaring, highly intoxicated by a massive, completely irrational, and entirely euphoric bull run. Absolutely everyone around him, the deeply uninformed suburban neighbors, the loud, screaming television pundits, and the highly arrogant, completely uneducated amateur speculators, were entirely, recklessly making massive amounts of temporary, highly volatile paper wealth. The river guide was strictly, fiercely, and entirely uncompromisingly ordered to sit completely still, holding his highly finite, precious cash entirely in absolute, boring, and highly secure reserve. This is the profound, terrifying, and deeply lonely crucible of the final mathematical pillar, the margin of safety. The mentor deeply, meticulously explained that the global stock market is absolutely not a perfectly rational, highly efficient calculating machine. It is, instead, a deeply manic depressive, highly emotional, and completely unstable biological entity that legendarily swings from extreme, euphoric, and entirely irrational overvaluation to deep, terrifying, and completely unjustified suicidal depression, to successfully, flawlessly mathematically guarantee the absolute, unyielding fulfillment of rule number 1, never, ever lose money. The investor absolutely must completely, violently detach their fragile human psychology from this manic, screaming, and highly infectious entity. They must rigorously, coldly, and entirely analytically calculate the absolute, fundamental, and deeply objective intrinsic economic value of the underlying business, entirely, permanently ignoring the flashing, chaotic digital price dancing on the television screen. This absolute intrinsic value, universally known in this highly powerful philosophy as the sticker price, is absolutely not a mystical, deeply arcane number entirely hidden in complex, proprietary Wall Street algorithms. It is a highly predictable, entirely rational, and incredibly simple mathematical projection based entirely on the historical, highly verifiable, and incredibly consistent free cash flow the specific business has already proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that it can reliably generate. The River Guide, using incredibly basic, fourth-grade mathematics entirely accessible to any functioning adult, meticulously, carefully projected the future, incredibly consistent earnings of his highly fortified, deeply moated companies, successfully arriving at the absolute, undeniable, and deeply objective true sticker price. But discovering this true, incredibly valuable number was only the absolute, agonizing beginning of the final, magnificent equation. If the incredibly rigorous, highly analytical math clearly dictated that the magnificent, entirely unassailable business was fundamentally worth exactly $100 per share, the deeply undisciplined, highly impatient amateur investor would eagerly, blindly purchase it at $95, completely, tragically believing they had successfully secured a brilliant, highly lucrative, and deeply discounted deal. The mentor violently, aggressively struck down this deeply flawed, highly dangerous, and entirely toxic thinking, the future of global commerce, entirely regardless of how incredibly wide the economic moat, how deeply resonant the meaning, or how profoundly honorable the management might be, is fundamentally, inherently, and completely unknowable. Massive, entirely unpredictable geopolitical wars, highly sudden, devastating global pandemics, or entirely unforeseen, massively destructive technological disruptions can instantly, violently alter the absolute best, most highly calculated financial projections. Therefore, the true, absolute master of rule number 1 demands an incredibly massive, incredibly deep, and entirely unbreachable protective shield against this completely unknown, highly terrifying future. This ultimate, invincible shield is the margin of safety. The River Guide was strictly, fiercely, and entirely unyieldingly ordered to completely, permanently divide his rigorously calculated sticker price completely in half. He was absolutely, under no circumstances, permitted to deploy a single, precious dollar of his finite, irreplaceable life energy unless the manic, deeply irrational stock market offered him his highly coveted, incredibly magnificent business at a massive, undeniably staggering 50% discount to its true, mathematically objective value. If the magnificent business was fundamentally worth $100, he absolutely, completely refused to pay a single, solitary penny more than exactly $50. This incredibly massive, entirely uncompromising 50% discount completely, permanently, and violently changes the entire mathematical physics of investing. It provides an incredibly vast, deeply comforting cushion that mathematically absorbs almost any entirely unforeseen corporate disaster. Fundamentally, beautifully guaranteeing that even if the River Guide's initial, highly rigorous calculations were slightly, entirely incorrectly optimistic, he still incredibly, mathematically avoids catastrophic, permanent financial loss. It completely removes the terrifying, highly paralyzing fear of being entirely wrong, safely replacing it with a deep, highly mathematical, and completely unshakable certainty. The agonizing, incredibly difficult, highly emotional, and deeply boring wait stretched for entirely exhaustive, completely silent months, fiercely testing the absolute limits of the River Guide's newly forged psychological discipline. And then, entirely predictably, entirely inevitably, the highly volatile, completely unstable macroeconomic environment violently, suddenly fractured. A massive, entirely terrifying global financial crisis violently erupted, sending absolute, screaming, and completely irrational panic rippling instantly through the heavily interconnected, deeply fragile global markets. The flashing digital numbers on the television screens violently, aggressively bled a deep, terrifying, and completely bottomless crimson red. Massive institutional investors, heavily leveraged, deeply panicked hedge funds, and entirely terrified retail amateurs frantically, desperately liquidated their entire, completely speculative portfolios, blindly throwing incredibly magnificent, highly profitable, and completely unassailable global businesses into the exact same chaotic, burning dumpster as the deeply flawed, highly toxic, and completely bankrupt speculative garbage. This was the exact, highly anticipated, completely mathematical, and deeply coveted moment of absolute, breathtaking maximum pessimism, while the entire, screaming world aggressively, blindly ran for the exits, completely entirely consumed by biological, highly paralyzing terror. The river guide calmly, peacefully, and entirely rationally stepped forward into the violent, churning financial maelstrom. He looked closely, fiercely at his highly curated, entirely exclusive watch list, the incredibly magnificent, deeply moated, and highly honorable companies, whose fundamental, cash-generating business models were completely, entirely unaffected by the temporary, highly emotional panic of the stock market, were now violently, absurdly trading at massively discounted, entirely irrational prices. The manic-depressive market was frantically, desperately offering him a pristine, undeniable $100 bill for exactly $50. The river guide, his mind completely, permanently forged in the incredibly hot, highly disciplined fires of the 4Ms, and his emotions entirely neutralized by the massive mathematical shield of the margin of safety. Aggressively, ruthlessly, and completely fearlessly deployed his highly protected, massive cash reserves. He entirely bought the magnificent, heavily fortified economic castles at a massive, completely undeniable, and deeply lucrative half-price fire sale, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty that he was entirely safe. As the incredibly chaotic, deeply terrifying dust of the global financial panic inevitably, completely settled, and the deeply manic, highly emotional market slowly, agonizingly regained its fundamental, entirely rational economic senses, the absolute, unshakable mathematical truth of the universe brilliantly, beautifully reasserted its total, undeniable dominance. The massive global market deeply, collectively realized that the magnificent, highly moated businesses were still incredibly, massively profitable, still entirely dominating their respective global industries, and completely, fundamentally worth their original, highly objective sticker price. The heavily depressed, violently discounted stock prices began their incredibly rapid, highly exponential, and entirely inevitable ascent back to their true, fundamental, and entirely rational valuation, when the price finally, beautifully reached the true, calculated $100 mark. The frantic, highly relieved market celebrated the supposed recovery, but the river guide experienced a massive, entirely different, and profoundly life-altering mathematical reality, because he had fiercely, aggressively, and entirely courageously purchased the magnificent asset at exactly $50. His finite, precious capital had mathematically, undeniably, and completely safely doubled. He had successfully, flawlessly achieved a staggering, incredibly massive 100% return on his deeply protected, highly finite life energy, completely, entirely without ever once exposing himself to the terrifying, highly destructive risk of permanent, catastrophic financial loss. He successfully, flawlessly, and incredibly patiently repeated this incredibly boring, highly disciplined, and completely mathematical process over the heavily condensed, highly transformative span of exactly 5 years. The incredibly tiny, seemingly insignificant, and deeply fragile $1,000 grub stake entirely, mathematically, and beautifully compounded into a staggering, deeply unshakable, entirely sovereign, and completely massive $1 million financial fortress. The impoverished, entirely terrified river guide had completely, permanently, and violently mutated into a massive, highly sovereign, and entirely untouchable master of the global financial universe, completely leaving behind the grueling, highly dangerous physical river to peacefully navigate the deep, entirely invisible currents of generational wealth, entirely without ever requiring a complex, highly expensive Wall Street advisor, and absolutely, fundamentally without ever once violating the incredibly sacred, deeply mathematical, and entirely unyielding law of rule number 1. The ultimate, earth-shattering, incredibly profound, and deeply psychological meaning that rule number 1 fiercely, aggressively, and beautifully intends to convey to its exhausted, highly manipulated readers is a complete, violent, highly intellectual, and entirely spiritual revolution against the deeply entrenched, Globally accepted, incredibly toxic dogma of financial helplessness and deeply institutionalized market dependency. The core, beating, highly profound, and completely undeniable message is that the heavily constructed, highly intimidating, and entirely fabricated wall of financial complexity erected by the massive, trillion-dollar global investment industry is a carefully orchestrated, highly destructive, and deeply cynical illusion designed entirely, specifically to harvest your precious, finite wealth and keep you completely, perpetually enslaved to their entirely exorbitant, highly hidden management fees. The book serves brilliantly as a profound, transformative, incredibly sharp, and highly psychological blueprint, teaching absolutely that by aggressively, ruthlessly, and entirely abandoning the deeply toxic, highly corrosive gamble of blind market speculation, heavily prioritizing the uncompromising, deeply analytical evaluation of fundamentally magnificent, highly moated businesses, and rigorously wading in deep, highly disciplined silence for the completely inevitable, highly irrational market panics to provide a massive, mathematically invincible margin of safety. You can effectively, beautifully hack the entire global financial universe and violently accelerate the deep, profound, and entirely liberating accumulation of absolute, generational wealth. You do not secure your absolute financial freedom by blindly trusting the chaotic, screaming madness of the market. You secure it by coldly, ruthlessly, and mathematically exploiting that exact madness to buy magnificent certainties at a massive, undeniable discount.